Hey everybody, it's Ron from Pick Dawgz, and this is the NFL edition of Ron's Rundown. We're going to go over all the Week 9 games of the NFL season, starting with the Thursday night game, ending with Monday Night Football. If you like what you see and you enjoy these types of videos, make sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel. Helps us out a ton. And don't forget to put your football plays in the comments section below. If you're looking for my best bets, of course, you can find those at the Premium Picks tab at pickdawgz.com. And don't forget, college basketball is right around the corner. I'll be producing daily college basketball videos. We're going to go over a few games a day in college hoops, my favorite sport to bet on, so check out those videos starting on Tuesday. Alrighty, let's get into it. Here are the NFL games scheduled for Week 9. First up, we see the Philadelphia Eagles taking on the Houston Texans. We're going to see the Eagles as 14-point favorites, and the total set at 45 points for this Thursday Night Football game on Prime Video. When you look at the Houston Texans, they're struggling defensively in terms of yards allowed. Each of the 7 opponents that they've faced this season have got 350 or more yards in each of those games. Even though Houston's only given up 22 points per game, I still think their defense is far worse than that total. I think as the season continues and as the schedule gets a little bit tougher for the Texans, I think that points per game allowed is going to go up and up and up. And when you look at last week against the Tennessee Titans, yes, the Titans only scored 17, and yes, Malik Willis, the backup quarterback, didn't do much through the air. But you got to look at what the Texans' ground game allowed, the ground game defense allowed, over 300 rushing yards and 7 yards per carry. Derrick Henry had one of the best games of his career, and that makes it back-to-back-to-back weeks, 3 weeks in a row, where the Texans have given up more than 5 yards per carry to their opposition. And again, it hasn't really been the strongest strength of schedule. When you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, one of the best teams in the NFL, the only team that is undefeated right now, they're able to run the football very well with their running back group, but also their quarterback in Jalen Hurts, who's just under 300 rushing yards on the season and 6 rushing touchdowns himself. So I think the Eagles have a field day offensively, but I do think the Texans can compete in this game offensively. Even though last week was not a great performance, I still think Davis Mills is having a decent year as far as a backup QB goes, and as far as a QB that they need to put in this year while they look for their franchise replacement in the next few seasons and the next few drafts. But overall, Davis Mills about 64% completion percentage. Dameon Pierce running at a 4.8 yards per carry clip. I'll take that all day long for my rookie running back. I think this Texans offense finds a few touchdowns, maybe a backdoor cover, because this spread is very large at 14 points. But I'm going to take the over in this game between the Eagles and Texans to start the week. Next up, we have the Colts and the Patriots. The Patriots are 5.5-point favorites in this one, and I do think there's going to be a pretty low-scoring game overall. We see one of the lower totals of the week here at 39 points, and if it is a low-scoring game, I think there's actually some value here with the road team getting 5.5 points in a game that should be close and competitive. And you look at the Colts offensively; they haven't done much this season. Now, injuries have played a role into that, but also bad quarterback play by Matt Ryan has not helped things at all. And last week, only 324 yards against the Commanders, only 16 points in that one. Jonathan Taylor's been in and out of the lineup with injuries. They just traded Nyheim Hines, their backup running back. So, the depth is a little bit of a concern for the Colts offensively. But you look at the New England Patriots, their offense under 300 yards each of the last 2 weeks. They suffered 6 sacks last week against the New York Jets. And this Colts team has done a pretty good job defensively at getting pressure on the opposing quarterback, doing a good job at stopping the run. And the secondary has really improved from where we saw it last season, where it was one of the worst secondaries in the AFC. I do think that the Colts defense can keep this team in this game. I think it's going to be a pretty low-scoring, sloppy, ugly game, but in the end, I think the Colts cover the number. Wouldn't be surprised to see the Patriots win it outright, but give me the points here with the Indianapolis Colts. Next up, we see the Buffalo Bills taking on the New York Jets. The Bills are big favorites here on the road, laying 13. Total set at 47, and I actually like the over in this game. Even though you look at this series and you look at overall divisional games in the NFL, usually you think a low-scoring, tight game. And in this series between the Bills and Jets, the last 6 games, 4 of those 6 have gone under the number. But you look at this Bills defense, it's looked a little bit human the last few weeks. They've given up over 350 yards in each of those games, and they struggled against the run last week, giving up on 31 carries, 208 rushing yards at 6.7 yards per carry. When you look at this Jets team, even though they don't have Breece Hall as he's out for the season, they still have James Robinson and Michael Carter. And I do think the Jets are going to look to run the football a lot in this game, probably 25 or more times in this one. And, Zach Wilson struggled quite a bit in his first few weeks with the Jets. And overall, last week, he had made a few key mistakes in that game, and he was only 20 of 41 passing, but he did have over 300 passing yards against a really good Patriots secondary. I do think this could be a spot where the Jets offense wakes up a little bit, and we saw in the middle of this season, this Jets offense was scoring some points, 31 on the Cleveland Browns, 24 against the Steelers, 40 against the Dolphins, and 27 against Green Bay. I think we see him over 24 points in this one. I think the Bills take care of the rest. success. We know this Bills offense is going to score 29 points per game this season, over 400 yards per game. Even though the Jets defense has held up well, I don't think it's going to hold up much in this spot. So I like the over in this Bills-Jets game in this AFC East rivalry. In our next game, we see the Miami Dolphins taking on the Chicago Bears. The Dolphins are 5-point favorites on the road. Total set at 45.5. I'm leaning towards the Dolphins here, laying the points away from home. When you look at Miami, they've been pretty good against the run. Now, their secondary has struggled quite a bit, but luckily for the Dolphins, they're facing a team in Chicago that doesn't really like to throw the football much because Justin Fields hasn't had a lot of time in the pocket to make a lot of decisions and make a lot of big throws. The Bears have relied on their ground game, which has been successful. I mean, they've had over 200 rushing yards the last 3 weeks, but like I said, the Dolphins have been really good against the run. In 4 of their last 5 games, the Dolphins have held their opponent to under 100 rushing yards in those games. And you look at the Dolphins offensively, last week, one of the best performances they've had this season. Not the best, because we saw them put up 42 points and over 500 yards against the Ravens in week 2, but last week against the Detroit Lions, 476 yards, 369 of those through the air. Tua Tagovailoa had a great game. Tyreek Hill also had a big game, and Jalen Waddle as well. But 31 points for the Dolphins in that one. The defense struggled against the pass, but it was pretty good against the run and against the Bears team that doesn't throw the football much and has really big issues with their offensive line. I don't think the Bears offense can really exploit those Dolphins defensive weaknesses. And when you look on the other side of the ball, we saw the Bears struggle quite a bit last week against the Cowboys ground attack, giving up 6.9 yards per carry. Now you lose Roquan Smith to the trade deadline as he's on his way to Baltimore for the Ravens. I don't love this defensive outlook in this game. Give me the Miami Dolphins laying the points on the road. Next up, we see the Minnesota Vikings taking on the Washington Commanders. The Vikings are 3.5-point favorites in this one. Now, I mentioned in last week's video that I like the Vikings. I laid the points against the Cardinals, and they covered the number for us, 34-26 final score. But I mentioned in that game that I thought that the value that we were getting with the Vikings was starting to the value we were getting at the beginning of the season was starting to slip in games like against the Cardinals. And this is a spot here against the Commanders that I think the value's on the other side. I like Washington plus the 3.5 points. I think Washington's defense has been one of the better defenses, one of the more underrated defenses in the NFC this season. You've seen in the last 5 weeks, they've held their opponents, 3 of their last 5 opponents, to under 300 total yards. And last week against the Colts, only giving up 16 points, giving their team a chance to win. And we saw Taylor Heineke, who's now 2-0 both straight up and against the number, ever since taking over at quarterback for the injured Carson Wentz. We saw him lead his team to about a 90-yard touchdown, game-winning touchdown drive against Indianapolis on the road. And, Taylor Heineke, I think, is an upgrade, actually, compared to Carson Wentz, who was really struggling with his decision-making. Even though the passing yards and completion percentage was strong, he was making a lot of mistakes and taking a lot of sacks. Taylor Heineke is actually a little bit more of a dual threat than you would think. And we saw in the last drive, in that final touchdown drive, he made a few big plays with his legs to give the Commanders another chance in that one. I think this Commanders offense is in a better place with Heineke. I think the defense is playing well. And when you look at the Vikings, I think they've overperformed their expectations. I think there's a little bit overvalued with the Vikings here. And I do think the secondary is also something I'm a little bit concerned with right now. Pretty good completion percentage allowed to opposing teams. And even though they're getting pressure on opposing quarterbacks, I do think that the Commanders are going to be able to throw the football in this game quite consistently. So give me the Washington Commanders here plus the 3.5 points. I'm going to sprinkle a little bit on the money line as well. Next up, we see an NFC North battle between the Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions. The Packers are 3.5-point favorites, total set at 50 points. Now, when you look at this particular matchup and this rivalry and you see how the home team has done against the number, the home team has dominated in the last few years. In the last 7 matchups between these two teams, the home team is 6-1 against the spread. But the big thing for me is, in a lot of those games, even when the Packers were on the road, they were still favorites by a touchdown or more because the Packers teams in recent years were pretty successful. I mean, last year's team still made the playoffs, and Aaron Rodgers and company still had Devontae Adams, so they were still big favorites, and it was tough to lay a lot of points with the road team in a divisional game. But now you're not having to lay a lot of points. You're only laying 3.5 here with Green Bay. I think there's a little bit of value because the Packers have lost 4 straight games. They've looked ugly offensively, but last week I think was a little bit of a turning point. They covered the number against the Bills, 27-17. They were getting 10.5 points in that one, but the offense had just under 400 total yards of offense, and the rushing game was very successful, 6.7 yards per carry on the ground. Even though Aaron Rodgers in the passing game hasn't really gotten going this season, I still think when you're facing a Detroit Lions defense, that I think it's the Lions and the Texans, the top 2 worst defenses in the NFL right now. I think this is a perfect breakout spot for Rodgers and company, as the Lions last week giving up 476 yards of offense and 31 points to the Miami Dolphins. They've now given up 32 points per game and over 400 yards per game on the season. The secondary, one of the worst, if not the worst, in the NFL. So this is a great spot for the Packers and Rodgers to get going offensively. Even though Green Bay struggled overall this season, it really hasn't been because of their defense. The defense is still hanging in there. Even last week against the Bills, while it may not be great to give up 27 points and 370 yards, it's actually a lot better than most teams have done against Buffalo this season. So I actually like the Green Bay Packers here laying the points on the road because we're getting a really good price because of the Packers' struggles. Next up, we see the Los Angeles Chargers taking on the Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons are 3-point dogs at home. Total set at 49 points. Now, when you look at this game, I think that the Chargers have a big advantage offensively because they're facing a Falcons defense that has really struggled the last few weeks. I mean, against the Cincinnati Bengals, they gave up 35 points and 537 total yards. And then just last week, I mean, you look at that game against the Bengals, you're on the road facing Joe Burrow, and that was when Jamar Chase was still playing. It's a tough spot for the Falcons defense. You never want to give up over 500 yards in the NFL, but maybe you could let it slide. But last week, you just can't let it slide. I mean, it was 478 total yards to P.J. Walker and no Christian McCaffrey in the Panthers offense, and 34 points allowed in that game. And honestly, I know it took a Hail Mary to get there, but the Panthers still had a very good chance to win that game when they missed the extra point to win it in the end, and then they go to the overtime but missed the field goal. So the Falcons pretty fortunate to win that game in the end. But the defense has not been fortunate at all. The secondary's really struggled, and now you got Justin Herbert, who's had plenty of time in the pocket. I mean, even though the run game hasn't really been there for the Chargers, Justin Herbert and the Chargers quarterback play has only been sacked on 3.2% of passing plays this season. So I do think that the Chargers offensive line is going to have a nice day here. And I think the Chargers offensively are going to put up 30-plus points in this one. And that should be well more than enough for a cover on the road. So in a must-win game for the Chargers after that bad game against the bad week against the Seahawks where they lost by two touchdowns, they're off the bye week here. They're rested. I think they're ready to go. Give me the Chargers laying the points on the road. Next up, we see the Carolina Panthers taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. We just mentioned how both of those teams did pretty good against the Falcons defense. Now they play against each other. We're going to see the Bengals here as 7.5-point favorites. Total set at 42.5. Now, for me, this is a tough game. I don't really love the price that we're getting here with Cincinnati. They did lose last week on Monday Night Football, so it's going to be a little bit of a short week, and it was not a good performance. 32-13. They got outgained by over 200 yards. Ugly, ugly game. Now, that was without Jamar Chase, but still, it was not a good performance at all from Cincinnati on either side of the ball. In this particular spot, though, when you look at Cincinnati, they've just been so much of a polar opposite when compared to their road and home games. On the road, they've been one of the worst teams in the NFL. We've seen them lose to the Cowboys. We saw them play well against the Jets, but struggle against the Ravens. The Saints game was kind of all over the place, and then they struggled mightily against the Browns. But in their home games, you take out that Pittsburgh Steelers game where they still outgained Pittsburgh by quite a few yards, but lost it in the end. They beat up on the Dolphins on Thursday Night Football, played very well against the Falcons, where I mentioned they had 500 total yards of offense. I think this Bengals team at home here is where I would want to be on them. Fade them on the road, take them at home. So give me the Cincinnati Bengals laying the points at home. I just don't trust this Panthers offense to repeat that kind of performance week after week. Next up, we see the Jacksonville Jaguars taking on the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders are 1.5-point favorites here. Total set at 48 points. Now, I'm going to take the team total over here for Jacksonville at 23.5 points. I think they get 24 plus in this one. As when you look at their offense, yes, they're only scoring 22 points per game. And the last couple of weeks, only 17 points against the Giants and the Broncos. But the big thing for me is the Jaguars are consistently moving the ball. Now, mostly on the ground. I mean, they had 6.0 yards per carry against the Broncos, 6.8 against the Giants, 7.4 against the Colts. This team is running the football very efficiently and consistently, but the thing is, this Jaguars offense has just made a lot of key mistakes at certain really bad times. We saw against the Giants a couple weeks back where Travis Etienne had an easy touchdown. He fumbles the ball near the end zone, and it's a 7-point swing right there. We saw in that same game where the Jaguars offense had the ball deep into Giants territory. They had 3rd and inches, couldn't get it. 4th and inches, couldn't get it, and the turnover on downs really hurts them in that game. They ended up losing that one 23-17. So this offense, in their last 4 games, they've had over 400 yards in 2 of those 4 games. You want to know how many points they scored in those 2 games combined where they had over 400 yards? 23 points. It's bound to end at some point. Trevor Lawrence in the offense is not as bad as the points per game total says on paper. They're moving the ball pretty consistently, and now they're facing a Raiders defense that was miserable against the Saints last week. wasn't very good against the Texans the week before, has a really struggling secondary, and is not stopping the run at a very good clip. Give me the Jacksonville Jaguars over the team total at 23.5 points. Next up, we see the Arizona Cardinals taking on the Seattle Seahawks. This is one of two 4 o'clock games for Week 9. Only two 4 o'clock games in terms of Eastern Standard Time for Week 9. But when you look at this game, we see the Cardinals as 2-point favorites and the total set at 50.5. And that's a little bit of a surprise when you see the first game that these two teams played against each other, a 19-9 final score that went well under the total. But I actually do think it makes a lot of sense for this total to be set so high, as I like both of these offenses and I do not like either of these defenses. So I'm actually going to take the over in this game. I do expect a shootout performance, very unlike what we saw in the first meeting between these two teams. When you look at Arizona, last week against the Vikings, 34 points allowed and 381 yards allowed. They struggle against the ground game for Minnesota, and I didn't like the way their defense played at all. And yet again, this team has not really got a lot of pressure on opposing QBs. That's hurt them defensively for most of the season. The week before that, they gave up 34 points to the Saints, but I think it could have been a lot uglier if it wasn't for 2 pick sixes at the end of the second quarter in that one. They still gave up the Cardinals 494 yards of offense and over 400 yards to which quarterback, you say? Andy Dalton. So I just really don't love this Cardinals defense right now. I think their secondary's in a bad spot. They don't get pressure on the QB, and even their ground game defense, like we mentioned, again, with the Vikings, 6 yards per carry for Minnesota last week. I don't think it's in a great place. So I do think Geno Smith, who's been one of the more underrated quarterbacks in the league, and I think the Seahawks offense in general has been super underrated. I think the Geno Smith in the offense has some success here. But again, I don't love this Seahawks defense, even though it was good last week against the Giants. Overall, it's been pretty mediocre. They give it up a pretty good amount of yards on the ground to opposing teams. Even their secondary at times has struggled quite a bit. And the Arizona Cardinals, I will give them this. Their offense has improved quite a bit from where we saw it at the beginning of the year. I mean, week 1 against the Chiefs, they had 282 yards and 21 points. And even against the teams like the Rams, where they only had 12 points in that game, 17 against the Eagles, 9 against the Seahawks the first time these teams met. But the last 2 weeks, 42 points and 26 points. They're moving the football through the air, and a big part of that's been DeAndre Hopkins coming back. I think the Cardinals score plenty in this one as well. Give me the over in the Seahawks-Cardinals game, a much more entertaining game than the first time these teams met. Next up, we see the Tampa Bay Buccaneers taking on the Los Angeles Rams. The Bucs are 3-point favorites here, and the total set at 42.5 points. Now, last week was a tough week for the Bucs to take a loss where they were winning at halftime and looked pretty good at halftime over the Ravens, and their defense struggled quite a bit in that second half, giving up at the end of the game 7 yards per carry and 231 rushing yards. And now they learn that Shaq Barrett, one of their best defenders, is going to be out for the remainder of the season as he got injured in that game against the Ravens. So a real tough week, but since they did play that Thursday night game, they've had a little bit of more of an extended rest, 10 days off compared to the Rams, who are going to be playing on back-to-back Sundays. I do think there's a little bit of an advantage there for the Rams, whose defense has been pretty good otherwise. I mean, last week they struggled, and against the Panthers were able to run the football pretty effectively. But other than that, the Bucs defense has been one of the better ones in the NFC. But the Rams, their offense has really struggled. Matt Stafford having one of the worst seasons of his career, in my opinion, especially when you look at his decision-making. His touchdown-to-interception ratio is actually 6-8. He's had more interceptions than touchdown passes. Not what you want to see. And last week against the 49ers, only 223 total yards of offense. They haven't been able to run the football, and that's really hurt them this season as their offense has become one-dimensional, and it's not good enough. And I do think the Bucs defense, with head coach Todd Bowles, who's a more defensive-minded guy, I think the Bucs defense will be in a much better place this week. And I look for the Bucs to have a bounce-back performance from their bad loss last week against the Ravens. I think this is a big turnaround game for really either team. If either team grabs a win here, it could save their season, but I do think the Bucs are in a much better place. Give me the Tampa Bay Buccaneers laying the points. I think they get a home win and cover. Next up, we see your Sunday Night Football contest on NBC. It's the Tennessee Titans and the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs are 12.5-point favorites, 13-point favorites at some books, and the total is set at 46.5 points. Now, really, I told myself when the Chiefs returned from their bye week that really I was going to write a blank check for wherever they were laying against the Titans. I was going to lay the points, and I think it's actually a little bit reasonable that we're laying 12.5, 13 points in this game. I think the Chiefs are a far better team. I think they're more than 2 touchdowns better than the Titans, especially when you're getting Andy Reid off a bye. I mean, this has been one of the better coaches in the NFL when he's off of a bye, both straight up and against the number with the Eagles and the Chiefs, and especially when he's playing at Arrowhead or at home. And, I do think this is a great spot for the Kansas City Chiefs facing a Titans team off a win. but I still don't trust this offense, and I don't think that their defense is going to hold up very well at all. Last week was a great performance from the Titans secondary. I got to give them credit. I didn't see it coming, but I don't think that when you look at the body of work overall this season, the Titans secondary has really struggled. Now you're facing a rested and potent Patrick Mahomes and Chiefs offense that just added another weapon. If he plays in this one, Kadarius Toney. I don't like the Titans' defensive chances in this game. The Chiefs' defense, I think, is good enough in this spot. Give me the Kansas City Chiefs. Land the 13 points. I think they win this game by more than 2 touchdowns. And in our final game of the week, we see your Monday Night Football contest on ESPN. It's an 8:15 Eastern start time between the Baltimore Ravens and the New Orleans Saints. The Ravens are 3-point favorites, and the total's set at 48 points. Now, unders have done a great job in the NFL to start the year. It's actually been the best start for unders in the NFL for the last 20 years, and just in terms of win-loss record and profitability. And unders in primetime games have also been really profitable this season, but I do think as the season continues, we're going to start to see some value in overs, especially in primetime games, and this is a spot exactly where I think the total should be above 50 points, and since it's at 48, I'm going to take the over here. When you look at the Ravens, this is a team that moves the football well. They score plenty of points, and against the Saints defense that I'm still not necessarily sold on, I think the Ravens will have plenty of success in this game offensively. And when you look at Andy Dalton and the Saints, yes, Andy Dalton struggled in primetime games, but we saw a couple of weeks ago in a primetime game against the Cardinals, Saints-Cardinals 42-34 final. Andy Dalton was helping his team and the other team get to the over as he was throwing the ball pretty well for the Saints. He had 400 passing yards in that game, and the Saints put up 34 points, but he also helped the other team by throwing 2 pick sixes at the end of the second quarter and putting some points on the board. He wanted to make sure they got way over the total in that game, and he wanted to make sure the Cardinals would cover the spread. But and all joking aside, I do think Andy Dalton does have enough success here against the Ravens defense that's been so, especially against the pass. I think this game goes over the number. Give me the over in this Ravens-Saints game to end the week. And that's it. Those are the games for Week 9 of the NFL season. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. And don't forget to put your football plays in the comments section below. Again, if you're looking for my best bets, you can find those at Pick Dawgz Premium. As always, this is Ron Romanelli. Good luck.